There's a clock running inside every narcissistic relationship, one you were never given, one he'd never admit exists, but one that governs almost every instance of cruelty with a precision that only becomes visible in hindsight. Once you finally step back far enough to see the pattern, instead of just living inside each isolated incident. Because here's something almost nobody explains clearly enough about narcissistic cruelty. It doesn't strike randomly, and it doesn't strike constantly. It strikes at specific times, calibrated with disturbing consistency around particular windows when his tactics are most likely to succeed and least likely to face genuine consequence. If you've ever wondered why the worst moments always seem to arrive at oddly specific times, right before something important, right after something good, right when you were most vulnerable to being believed rather than questioned. You weren't imagining a pattern. You were living inside one. Today, we're going to map out exactly when a narcissist chooses to attack, because understanding this timing with complete clarity does something almost nothing else can do. It removes the element of surprise that made each individual incident feel so disorienting, so impossible to predict, so exhausting to constantly brace against without ever knowing exactly when the next one might arrive. Let's start with the single most common attack window because it's often the one victims recognize last, precisely because it seems so counterintuitive on the surface. The favorite time, right after you've achieved something good. This is, without question, one of the most consistent, most reliable patterns in narcissistic cruelty, and it's also one of the most psychologically confusing to live through because it inverts everything you'd naturally expect about how someone who claims to love you should respond to your genuine happiness or success. A promotion at work, a moment of real confidence following a difficult personal breakthrough, a reconnection with old friends that leaves you glowing. A compliment from someone else that makes you feel genuinely, independently good about yourself. Watch closely, and you'll likely notice that these exact moments, the ones that should theoretically be celebrated, supported, shared, instead precede some of the sharpest cruelty in the entire relationship, arriving within hours, sometimes even minutes, of your genuine happiness registering. This timing isn't coincidental, and understanding why requires remembering something we've discussed extensively in previous conversations. A narcissist's sense of significance depends on remaining central to your emotional experience. Your independent happiness, joy that exists and flourishes without requiring his involvement or approval, represents a direct, immediate threat to that centrality. It reveals undeniably that your capacity for genuine contentment doesn't actually depend on him, which means his careful positioning as essential to your well-being has just been quietly, definitively disproven. This is precisely why attacks so often arrive right at the peak of your happiness rather than during your struggles, when his intervention or support might genuinely be relevant and appreciated. The attack isn't really about whatever specific pretext gets used to justify it. It's about reasserting relevance at the exact moment his own dispensability has become most visible, even if only to him, even if he'd never consciously articulate this motivation to himself. The second favorite time, right before you're about to do something independently, without him. This timing window operates on a closely related principle, but focuses specifically on anticipated independence rather than already achieved happiness. Pay attention to what happens in the hours or days leading up to plans that don't include him. A girl's trip, a family visit on your side alone, a work conference, any event where you'll be operating entirely within your own social world, your own support system, your own sense of self that exists independent of the relationship. You'll often find that conflict, crisis, or cruelty conveniently erupts right before these moments, timed with a precision that seems designed specifically to either prevent you from going entirely or to ensure you go while emotionally destabilized, distracted, and unable to fully enjoy or benefit from the independence the event was meant to provide. This pattern serves a specific strategic function, even when it's not consciously calculated as strategy in the moment. If he can't prevent the event itself, he can at least ensure that your experience of it gets contaminated by unresolved tension, guilt, or anxiety that follows you into the independent space, effectively limiting how much genuine benefit, renewed confidence, strengthened outside relationships, reminder of your own capability separate from him, you're actually able to extract from time spent away from his influence. The third favorite time, immediately after you've expressed a boundary. This is one of the clearest, most direct patterns in narcissistic attack timing, and it reveals something crucial about the actual function these attacks serve. When you finally, clearly articulate a limit, "I won't tolerate being spoken to that way. I need you to respect this specific request. This behavior isn't acceptable to me." Pay close attention to what happens in the immediate aftermath. Rather than producing acknowledgement or adjustment, boundaries expressed to a narcissist frequently produce escalation, arriving swiftly enough that the connection between your boundary and his subsequent cruelty becomes difficult to miss once you're actually looking for it. This isn't coincidental frustration boiling over. It's a direct, almost mechanical response designed to teach you, through immediate unpleasant consequence, that expressing boundaries produces punishment rather than respect, making you significantly less likely to attempt the same boundary again in the future. This timing pattern explains something that confuses so many people throughout narcissistic relationships: the sense that boundaries somehow make things worse rather than better, the opposite of what boundaries are supposed to accomplish in healthy relationships. Understanding that this worsening is actually a deliberate, if often unconscious, strategy, punishment specifically calibrated to discourage future boundary setting, removes the confusion and reveals exactly what's actually happening. Not random bad luck, but a system working precisely as designed to keep boundaries from ever becoming a reliable, safe tool in this specific relationship. The fourth favorite time, right when you're about to have an important conversation with someone else. This timing window is particularly insidious because it often produces the appearance of coincidence, even to the person experiencing it repeatedly. A crucial conversation with a therapist scheduled weeks in advance somehow coincides with a manufactured crisis that leaves you too emotionally depleted to fully engage with it. An important meeting with a lawyer, a doctor, a trusted family member. Any conversation where an outside perspective might genuinely help you see the relationship more clearly frequently gets preceded by exactly the kind of disruption that makes full engagement with that outside perspective significantly harder to achieve. This pattern deserves particular attention because it reveals something crucial about what narcissistic attacks are often actually protecting: not just his immediate emotional comfort, but active interference with any process that might genuinely help you develop clarity, support, or outside validation for what you're actually experiencing. Understanding this specific timing window, let's continue mapping this attack pattern, because the remaining windows reveal something even more specific about how deliberately this timing operates and how consistently it targets not random moments, but the exact circumstances where his behavior would otherwise face genuine accountability or where your own clarity might finally solidify into decisive action. The fifth favorite time, right when you've started to pull back emotionally. This timing window is one of the most reliable, and understanding it explains a pattern that confuses countless people throughout narcissistic relationships. The sense that just as they were finally starting to feel some distance, some emotional relief, some genuine detachment beginning to take root, something happens that pulls them straight back into crisis mode, as though he can somehow sense the exact moment your investment starts to genuinely waver. This isn't supernatural intuition. It's pattern recognition, honed over years of studying your specific emotional rhythms with an attentiveness most narcissists apply almost exclusively to detecting exactly this kind of threat. Small shifts in how quickly you respond to messages, subtle changes in tone, decreased enthusiasm during conversations, less frequent initiation of contact. All of these signal to someone finely attuned to reading you for exactly this purpose, that your emotional investment is beginning to genuinely decrease rather than simply fluctuating temporarily. The response to this detected pullback rarely looks like genuine curiosity about what's changed or genuine effort to understand and address whatever's driving your growing distance. Instead, it typically arrives as either intensified love bombing, designed to reignite exactly the emotional investment that's beginning to fade, or intensified cruelty and crisis, designed to occupy your emotional bandwidth so completely that genuine detachment becomes practically impossible to sustain, while you're consumed with managing whatever new disaster has suddenly, urgently demanded your full attention. This is precisely why so many people report the disorienting experience of feeling again and again as though they were finally on the verge of genuine emotional freedom, only to find themselves pulled back into crisis management right at the exact moment that freedom seemed within reach. This isn't random misfortune repeating itself indefinitely. It's a system specifically calibrated to detect and disrupt exactly this kind of emotional withdrawal before it can fully solidify into decisive action. The sixth favorite time, immediately before or during moments that would naturally provide you with outside validation. This timing window overlaps somewhat with what we discussed regarding important conversations, but extends more broadly to any circumstance where outside perspective, however casual or informal, might genuinely help you recognize patterns you're too close to see clearly on your own. Family gatherings where relatives who haven't been fully influenced by his narrative might notice something's wrong. Reunions with old friends who knew you before the relationship and might comment on how different you seem now. Even simple social situations where comparing notes with other people about relationship norms might reveal, through casual conversation, exactly how far outside normal his behavior has actually drifted. Watch closely, and you'll often find that conflict, anxiety, or manufactured crisis conveniently intensifies right around these specific opportunities for outside comparison, either preventing your full participation, ensuring you attend while too emotionally depleted to engage genuinely, or creating enough ongoing drama that conversations naturally center around managing the current crisis rather than allowing space for the kind of casual comparative conversation that might otherwise provide genuinely clarifying perspective. This pattern reveals something crucial about what these attacks are actually designed to protect. Not simply his immediate emotional state, but active ongoing interference with exactly the kind of external comparison and validation that consistently helps people trapped in narcissistic relationships finally see clearly what they're actually experiencing. The seventh favorite time, right after genuine intimacy or emotional closeness has occurred. This final timing window might be the most psychologically confusing of all to live through, precisely because it inverts everything about how emotional intimacy is supposed to function in healthy relationships. Genuine vulnerability, genuine emotional closeness, moments where real connection seems to be deepening in ways that feel authentic rather than performed. These moments, rather than being followed by continued warmth, frequently precede sudden coldness, unexpected criticism, or manufactured distance that arrives with confusing, whiplash inducing speed. Understanding why this specific pattern occurs requires remembering something fundamental about narcissistic psychology that we've discussed throughout previous conversations. Genuine intimacy requires a level of authentic self-exposure that a narcissist's defensive structure typically cannot sustain for extended periods without triggering significant internal discomfort. Real closeness, even when initially pursued and enjoyed, eventually activates exactly the vulnerability his entire psychological architecture is designed to avoid, producing a kind of unconscious retreat that manifests as sudden coldness or manufactured conflict. specifically because genuine sustained intimacy has become internally intolerable. This explains the confusing whiplash pattern so many people report throughout these relationships. Intense periods of apparent closeness and connection, followed by equally intense periods of coldness or cruelty, seemingly without any external trigger sufficient to explain the sudden shift. The trigger in these cases isn't external at all. It's the intimacy itself becoming uncomfortable enough to require disruption before it can deepen into something requiring more sustained vulnerability than his psychological structure can actually tolerate. Together, these 7 timing windows, after your achievements, before your independence, after your boundaries, before outside conversations, during your emotional withdrawal, before outside validation, and after genuine intimacy, reveal something that completely transforms how you understand every seemingly random, disconnected incident throughout the relationship. None of it was actually random. Every attack followed a consistent, almost mechanical logic, calibrated specifically around protecting his psychological centrality and preventing exactly the outcomes: your independence, your outside perspective, your genuine emotional withdrawal, your sustained vulnerability requiring reciprocal vulnerability he couldn't provide, that most directly threatened his continued control. And here's where understanding this timing pattern transforms from painful retrospective clarity into something genuinely protective, something that changes not just how you understand what already happened, but how you navigate every future relationship where similar patterns might eventually attempt to establish themselves again. Because once you can see these 7 windows clearly mapped across your own history, something remarkable happens to the exhausting unpredictability that used to define daily life in that relationship. The constant bracing, the persistent uncertainty about when the next attack might arrive, the sense that cruelty could strike at literally any moment without warning or logic. All of this dissolves, replaced by something far more manageable: recognition. You now understand that attacks weren't actually arbitrary. They followed identifiable triggers, specific circumstances that consistently preceded escalation, patterns precise enough that you could have, in retrospect, predicted many of these incidents before they occurred, simply by recognizing which window you were currently moving through. This retrospective clarity matters enormously, not simply as an intellectual exercise in understanding what happened, but because it fundamentally dismantles a specific kind of self-blame so many people carry after these relationships end. For years, perhaps, you searched for what you did to trigger each incident, some flaw in your own behavior that might explain why cruelty seemed to arrive so unpredictably, so disconnected from anything you could identify as an obvious cause. Understanding this timing pattern reveals something crucial. You were never actually doing anything wrong. You were simply moving through your own life, achieving things, pursuing independence, expressing reasonable boundaries, seeking outside perspective, building genuine intimacy, all completely normal, healthy behaviors that any reasonable partner should have supported rather than punished. The problem was never your achievements, your independence, your boundaries, your outside relationships, your emotional authenticity, or your capacity for genuine closeness. The problem was a system specifically calibrated to punish exactly these healthy expressions of your own selfhood, precisely because they threatened a dynamic that required your continued smallness, continued dependence, continued availability in order to function according to his psychological needs rather than yours. This is what becomes possible once this timing pattern is fully, completely understood, not just intellectually, but in the deeper, more integrated way that actually changes how you move forward. You develop something we might call predictive protection, a kind of pattern literacy that serves you in every future relationship, professional interaction, or friendship, where similar dynamics might eventually attempt to establish themselves again. Because now you know exactly what to watch for. If achievement, independence, boundaries, outside perspective, emotional withdrawal, external validation, or genuine intimacy consistently trigger escalated conflict or cruelty from someone in your life. This isn't simply unfortunate incompatibility or occasional friction. It's data, specific and actionable, worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as coincidence or your own oversensitivity. This is perhaps the most valuable gift hidden inside fully understanding these 7 timing windows. It transforms years of confusing, disorienting unpredictability into genuine pattern recognition, one that protects you far beyond this specific relationship, into every future context where someone's response to your healthy flourishing reveals whether they're actually capable of celebrating your growth or whether they require your continued smallness in order to feel secure in their own fragile significance. If you recognize this timing pattern clearly in your own relationship history, understand exactly what this recognition means and doesn't mean. It doesn't mean you were foolish for not seeing it sooner, because these patterns are specifically designed to feel disconnected, random, impossible to trace while you're living inside them without the benefit of retrospective distance. It doesn't mean you were somehow responsible for triggering cruelty through your own reasonable, healthy behavior, because the behaviors that triggered this pattern were never actually flaws requiring correction. They were exactly the kind of genuine, healthy living any decent relationship should have supported rather than punished. What this recognition does mean is something far more valuable than either of those painful alternative interpretations. It means you now carry genuine protective wisdom, an ability to recognize far earlier than you could before, exactly when someone's response to your achievements, your independence, your boundaries, your outside connections, your emotional authenticity, or your genuine intimacy reveals someone capable of real partnership or someone whose own psychological fragility requires your continued diminishment in order to feel secure. This is what it ultimately means to understand the narcissist's favorite time to attack. Not because understanding this timing erases the pain of what you experienced, but because it finally, completely transforms that pain into something usable, something protective, something that ensures you'll never again mistake calculated, predictable cruelty for random, unpredictable moodiness that leaves you constantly searching for some flaw in your own behavior to explain it. You weren't unlucky. You weren't difficult to love. You weren't somehow attracting chaos through your own inadequacy. You were simply living, growing, achieving, connecting, and expressing yourself in exactly the ways any healthy relationship should have celebrated. The timing of every attack you survived reveals not a flaw in you, but a system that found your genuine flourishing threatening enough to specifically, repeatedly target. And now that you can see the pattern clearly, it never has to catch you by surprise again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos.